Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for joining today's Annex IV State of the Science webinar. With that, I'll turn the call over to Luke Hanna, Marine Science and Policy Analyst. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the 9th Annex IV Environmental Webinar, titled Annex IV State of the Science webinar. As Emily mentioned, my name is Luke Hanna. I'm with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory here in Seattle, Washington, and I'm going to be moderating the questions for today's webinar. As the title describes, today's webinar will be on the recently published 2016 Annex IV State of the Science report, which summarizes the current knowledge and understanding of the effects of marine renewable energy devices on the marine environment, the animals that live there, and the habitats that support them. I'm not going to go too much further because today my colleague Andrea Copping will be telling you more about this new and exciting report. Andrea is the research lead for ocean energy development for Pacific Northwest National Laboratory on behalf of the U.S. Department of Energy. Her projects focus on environmental effects from the development of offshore wind, wave, and tidal energy installations, and the role that these effects play in the technology development and project initiation across the nation. As a U.S. representative for Annex IV, Andrea leads a team of PNNL researchers that implements this project on behalf of the U.S. Department of Energy and other federal partners. Her team at PNNL also uses risk-based approaches to integrate laboratory, field, and modeling measurements into a coherent body of evidence to support siting and permitting decisions. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Andrea.
Okay, thanks so much, Luke, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us here today. I am going to be representing basically the whole Annex IV team, which I'll mention to you in a moment, concerning the findings of this report that we have just released. And I'll show you where you can find it online shortly if you haven't already. Actually, the URL is there at the bottom of the screen. So the purpose of this report is really, as Luke said, to get at some of the environmental effects of marine renewable energy. And all of us on this call are probably involved in some way, so we know that this industry is in the early stages of development, and we're just trying to move towards commercialization. But it's no surprise, again, that there is a real need to streamline siting and permitting or consenting processes to be able to get both single devices and arrays in the water. The State of the Science report summarizes these interactions such that we know at the moment, based largely on published information and readily available data. It is our intent that the State of the Science informs regulators and researchers about potential risks from these wave and tidal devices. But we believe there's also real help for marine renewable developers not only getting their devices in the water, but there are the opportunities by understanding these environmental effects early on to have feedback loops to the engineering, the siting, the operational strategies, and also monitoring options that will make it easier to move these projects forward with minimal environmental concerns or damage. We think that this all comes together to shorten or simplify the timeline to permitting, consenting, deployment of these devices. There was a previous report published in 2013, also up on TETHIS, our knowledge management system, and we really picked up from where that report in 2013 left off. So for all of us here, we know why we're doing marine renewable energy. The drivers include the need for reliable low-carbon energy sources. We do have renewable standards in many nations and parts of countries. And there is also more and more concerns about energy security, being able to generate energy locally rather than importing fuels. But this doesn't mean that there aren't concerns about responsible development of marine renewable energy. Stakeholders continue to have concerns, and these really translate into regulatory and consenting processes that aren't yet well established with this new industry. And there's real reason for this. These are new, largely unknown technologies, and we don't know what potential harm could come about from them. We're using new uses of ocean space, and remembering the ocean is not an empty space. There are already many present users, from recreational users, commercial users, fisheries, shipping, etc. And these high-energy ocean environments where we might generate wave or tidal energy are probably least known of the ocean environments, with the exception of the deep sea, because as oceanographers, we do not traditionally take our gear to measure in these high energy environments, so it's really kind of tough to know about them. And finally, many of the marine species that have been raised as concerns around marine renewable energy devices are already under stress for other means, because of climate change, because of anthropogenic effects like fishing, displacement of habitat, and so on. So where Annex IV comes into this is Annex IV is a collaborative initiative under the Ocean Energy Systems. Ocean Energy Systems is a group of 23 nations interested in development of these resources that have come together under the International Energy Agency network. And the purpose of Annex IV, which was proposed by and led by the U.S., is to, as you see there, facilitate efficient government oversight of this industry, ensure that all existing information and data are widely shared, and to facilitate the knowledge and information transfer as development occurs anywhere in the world. We have this opportunity to share broadly. In this present state, working up to this State of the Science report, there were 13 member nations that participated in Annex IV. So the State of the Science report is actually a pretty good-sized document. I think it's 244 pages in its printed form. It consists of 10 chapters you see listed here, running from sort of an introduction of the whole set of issues through what we see as overall risks, and then looking at individual stressors or concerns for wave and tidal devices, as you can see there. The list of authors, we have authors from 5 different nations who participated in this, writing this report, and then many, many more who provided really important input. We had quite a number of peer reviewers who are very helpful in giving us guidance, bringing new and papers we hadn't seen to our attention, and so on. Okay, so what I'm going to do for a good part of this time is walk through these 10 chapters, just give you a little bit of a flavor of each one, some highlights, and then kind of talk about where we think this is going. So first and foremost, the first chapter is simply an introduction to the whole report, and the focus is really what's in this report. The highlights, we discuss the benefits of marine renewable energy in terms of climate change mitigation, energy security, etc. And this really came about was prompted by comments at a workshop we had last September in France, where it was pointed out to us by several developers that we talk a great deal about the possibly downside effects of marine renewable energy on the environment, but we seldom talk about why we're doing this and what are the good parts of it. And then there's a strong message in this chapter about the need to organize the international community around these environmental effects, that the time has not come in this industry for head-to-head competition, but rather for cooperation and collaboration. Chapter 2 really summarizes across all the reasonably potential effects of marine renewable energy devices. I think the overall scheme that Annex IV and many others working in this industry have really tried to work towards is to identify reasonably possible interactions and examine them and see which ones do not really make sense, where there is unlikely to be any potential pathway for harm. Put those aside and focus on those where we really don't understand and or we don't quite know what the outcomes may be. This chapter focuses on this overall risk of marine renewable energy devices, and we have throughout this chapter defined risk as the probability of a bad outcome and the consequence were that outcome to occur. So somewhere the chance of an animal having a bad encounter and how bad that encounter might be equates to risk. The highlights in this chapter, really summing it up, are that scientific uncertainty really drives a lot of the risk that is perceived today. And that is really what is driving concerns by regulators, stakeholders, etc. And if, in fact, it is scientific uncertainty underpinning much of this concern, this is an opportunity for where good, question-driven, hypothesis-driven data collection and research can really help reduce that uncertainty, get us a better sense of what may or may not be occurring. The risks that continue to float to the top, the ones that are the most difficult to understand and to kind of, really resolve, are the collision of animals with tidal turbines, underwater noise from devices and the effects they may have on animals, their behavior, etc., and also electromagnetic fields from cables and energized parts of devices. Although this one, there is hope we might be coming towards resolving that one. This is really sort of an unknown one that has raised a lot of concerns among regulators and stakeholders. I think it's fair to sum up that we generally think there is going to be little impact across all these risks from single devices. But as we move to much larger arrays to commercial size, we simply need to keep looking. We need further investigation. So, Chapter 3 deals with collision risk for animals around tidal turbines. This is the largest, most meaty chapter in the report, and this is because this is the one that with tidal devices, especially moving towards commercialization in the UK and elsewhere, is really hanging up permitting processes. So the focus obviously is the risk to animals from collision. This is largely around marine mammals, fish, and diving seabirds. It's important to note there have to date been not a single observation of collision of an animal with a device. But it's also important to note that the technologies, the instruments for observing collision aren't well developed. They're difficult to operate in these very high energy environments. Although there are several packages and really promising looking combinations of instruments under development, they are not yet at a state where we can commonly deploy them and really understand what's going on, be sure we're seeing what's happening very close to turbine blades with animals. We do need to have a sense of how many animals are in an area, therefore what's the probability they might wander into the swept area of a blade. And a good part of this that stymies our understanding is the behavioral aspects. We know that all marine animals have the ability to sense things underwater. The question is, what is their ability to sense and evade a spinning turbine blade? Because this will obviously have a major effect on how many are likely to be harmed or might be harmed. It's also important we need to note that the collisions with tidal turbines at the moment, we're really looking at individual animals, what is likely to be hit, a marine mammal, a fish, etc. But really, overall, from an environmental perspective, what we're interested in is putting these results in the context of risk to populations. And this is where some of these populations have already been depleted for other reasons, where so much of the concerns comes in, where loss of a single marine mammal might be of importance to a population, for example. Chapter 4 deals with the risk from underwater sound generated from wave energy converters and tidal turbines. The focus is just on that sound. It's the reason that we worry so much is, as most people on this call are probably aware, marine animals use sound underwater the way terrestrial animals use light they see on land. And so many animals, particularly marine mammals, but also fish and others, use sound to navigate, to communicate, hunt, etc. There's lots of anthropogenic sound in the oceans already, and the sound from these marine renewable energy devices simply adds to that sound. And the concern is it could disturb animals, from their normal ability. We talk about the masking of sound signals underwater. Think of a loud noise while you're trying to communicate with somebody on land. This is the same sort of thing that there are concerns of. Right now, we measure the noise from a single turbine or a WEC quite well, and we can actually, through modeling, predict what that sound might look like from an array of devices as it adds together. What we really don't understand is how this will affect animals. Again, what is the behavioral response? We just don't have the observations to know. In the extreme cases with underwater sound, the concerns are you could have physical harm that could include loss of hearing ability, harm to tissues, as well as the behavioral changes. But it's important to note that most research in this area that has shown these kinds of effects are very, very loud sounds, for instance, pile driving. much, much higher amplitude, different frequencies than we're likely to see out of these marine renewable energy devices. But we just don't really understand what those implications, especially for behavioral change, might be. Chapter 5 deals with the changes in physical oceanographic systems when you put WEX or tidal turbines in place. How does the flow change around, flow or wave heights change around these devices, and what happens as you're taking energy out of these systems in large amounts? We're clearly doing something in the ecosystem. So that's the focus, is what's the effect on ocean waters. We do know that if you put devices in place, it can change ocean circulation. For example, in an estuary or basin, many tidal devices will actually change how circulation occurs. And this may have other more far-reaching changes, such as changes in sediment transport, perhaps even changes in local food webs. But what we do know from modeling studies, and numerical models have been hugely helpful in this area, the amount of change we would see from single devices is way too small to be measurable. Now, as we got to much larger arrays, again, we can use numerical models to say what is the size of those arrays where we might begin to measure changes. And in most cases, the size of arrays are very, very large. So this is happily one of these items where it's important for developers to be able to show that the water body they are interested in developing in is not going to be affected, but the numerical models and the ability to do that from a desktop is very, very helpful, and means that there is not a lot of point to doing a great deal of monitoring in the environment. Okay, Chapter 6, effects of electromagnetic fields on marine animals. A big one that's come up. It's a little bit puzzling because we have had electrical cables in the ocean for well over 100 years, telecom cables, power cables, etc. But this has become a very big thing, probably because of other EMF effects that we've become familiar with from overhead power lines and cell phones and suggestions of health concerns. So we are interested in the effects on marine animals from cables, and also energized parts of devices, of course, are putting out electromagnetic fields, though relatively small ones. Again, there are naturally occurring magnetic fields in the ocean, and we know that certain animals have been shown, or many more are believed to be able to navigate and make use of these magnetic fields. Sometimes this is very circumstantial evidence. Salmon returning to their native waters it has been suggested they may be navigating on the Earth's magnetic field, partly because they had magnetite crystals in their heads. Never really been shown, but there are reason to believe that you could disturb animals in the ocean with electromagnetic fields. Now, it's important that animals have receptors in order to sense these fields and do anything about them. And we do know that some animals, particularly elasmobranchs or cartilaginous fish like sharks and skates and rays, have these sensory capabilities, as do certain invertebrates. But it's important to note not all sharks do, not all skates do, not all invertebrates. But these are the ones that we're focused on. Now, power cables generally can be shielded or buried and sort of separate the animals from the actual source of the EMF. Imagine burying an export cable, a meter or two down. You really do keep the exposure to a minimum. But we do need to think about where there are cables in the environment and what they might be doing. Now, most of the studies to date have focused on behavioral changes due to EMF. There is also some evidence there can be developmental or reproductive changes. But again, the field studies and lab studies that have been done to date do not indicate that the levels of EMF we would expect from these devices are likely to have very deleterious effects on any species. There's still some questions to be answered, and I suspect that we will still be talking about this one for a while to come, but hopefully we can move towards this not being one of the major issues in a few years' time. Chapter 7 deals with changes in habitats from devices, both benthic habitats and reefing patterns, and that's what what we're concerned about. It's important to note that if you put a device down on the bottom, whether you put a foundation down or an anchor or mooring lines, you can change those bottom habitats and therefore affect the habitat of the benthic organisms living there, the little worms and clams and microscopic things living in the sediment, also those that are living near the surface of the sediment and on the sediment. It's also important to note that when you put any structure in the ocean, some species of fish in particular, and some invertebrates, will be attracted to it. Everything from benthic and crusting organisms that will grow, barnacles and mussels and so on, but also fish, which will tend to come and hang around. Certain species will hang around almost any structure. However, it is important to note that these bottom footprints and this reefing sort of attraction does not differ from any other industry where we have placed structures in the marine environment, and mooring buoys and docks and so on and so forth. So we have a great deal that we can learn from those industries, both how they have managed this sort of thing. And also, it's important to note that we, again, have seen no negative effects from marine renewable energy devices or really any appropriate analog or surrogate. Whoa, oh dear, sorry about that. Let's go back. Okay, Chapter 8, Marine Spatial Planning and Marine Renewable Energy. Now, marine spatial planning, of course, is a process that many countries and regions have engaged in to really bring together for planning and managing purposes all those users of the ocean area to support sustainable use and development of those areas. And the purpose of this chapter really is to underscore the fact that marine renewable energy needs to be at the table during these processes. And that hasn't always been the case, but it's becoming a great deal better. And the author of this section, Anne-Marie O'Hagan out of Ireland, surveyed all the Annex IV countries about how they use marine spatial planning in their nations and what the involvement, what the relationship is to marine renewable energy. And what she found was across, a spread across the board, that several of the nations involved have formal marine spatial planning processes. Others use management plans that use some of those principles of marine spatial planning, and some of those countries had no such process in place. The overall conclusion here really is that using a stable and transparent planning system for marine activities and users will help keep us within the environmental limits we wish to have, but will allow for developments of industries like marine renewable energy and its coexistence with other marine industries. Chapter 9, Teresa Simas of Portugal and Juan Bald of Spain put this chapter together, and what they did is looked at case studies where there have been devices or areas permitted, or consented for marine renewable energy. They looked at 4 consented projects in order to see what lessons we can learn to try to move forward and make things better for the next projects. And the ones they looked at is the wave roller wave technology was installed off Portugal at the test center for a period of time. The Tidal power system by Ocean Renewable Power Company was installed in coastal Maine in the United States. The CGen Tidal technology by Marine Current Turbines, we all know is, I think, the iconic one we know of in that one right there, big one right there, in Strangford Lough in Northern Ireland. And then BMAP, the Biscay Marine Energy Platform, was a test site area in the Basque Country of Spain that was surveyed, permitted, cabled for testing. And there's a lot of detail in this chapter, but the sort of the big take-home messages are that carrying out strong stakeholder outreach during the process is absolutely tied to a successful and efficient permitting or consenting processes. Also, and these may seem very obvious, but in fact they're often not followed, but developing a robust monitoring plan both for monitoring before installation of devices and post-installation monitoring really adds to the success of the process, as does employing an adaptive management strategy and having a really good, robust environmental impact statement or environmental impact assessment. Also notably, it was found across all these four projects and also other Annex IV nations, there's really no dedicated policies that streamline development of wave and tidal devices, which really kind of helps, I think, the idea that maybe this is something where that has to happen in some of these countries. Okay, the last chapter, chapter 10, was a summary of the report and also talked about a path forward. What I've talked about is a lot of what we know and a lot of what we don't know. There is significant uncertainty in what we are aware of in terms of risk, and yet we need to move this industry forward. How do we do this in the face of this significant uncertainty? And I'm not going to talk about the summary at all, but we do know that those interactions with marine renewable energy devices and the environment and the animals, those that are perceived to be the most risky do appear to be related to uncertainty, not knowing what might happen. And we do know that by collecting additional information, we can likely reduce that uncertainty and move towards, we hope, retiring those risks that really are insignificant, where there is not being damage done, and we can understand how we can either avoid or even mitigate those risks. We may find that some mitigation is necessary throughout the life of these projects, and that's no different than any other industry. What we are particularly seeking to do is reduce monitoring requirements. If you are engaged in this industry, you've heard the industry say many times that the amount of monitoring they are being asked to do, baseline data collection, pre-installation, post-installation, is very large. And the research community isn't always certain that all the right data are being collected, and this is appearing as quite a financial burden on the industry. So, if you look at the little pie charts down below there, what this is trying to convey is that on the left-hand side, the present situation, that sort of brown-yellow color, is the vast majority of what we are looking at, these uncertain risks, and there's been a need to monitor for them. The small green slice speaks to the low risks, where we've already decided that there no further action is necessary. And as an example there, I'll give you chemical leaching. Devices will be painted with anti-fouling paints, anti-corrosive chemicals, but again, this is very, very common among any maritime industry, boat bottoms, docks, etc. We really understand what that kind of toxicity could mean to the marine environment. We can calculate very well with having a series of WECs or tidal turbines out what that would contribute to a water body, and we believe this to be a highly insignificant risk. The little red slice there, the high risk, are those we already understand and we must mitigate for. And so far in this industry, much of that mitigation, happily, has been before the fact, avoiding those kinds of potential high risks by careful siting, by redesign, by using different materials, etc. What we really envision is moving towards that right-hand pie chart by collecting further data to reduce uncertainty, where we have a situation where many more risks are retired in the green. We have some identified risks in red that we need to continue to mitigate for, and then we have a much smaller slice of continuing risk, which is where monitoring efforts need to be focused. But those monitoring efforts need to be very much question-driven, hypothesis-driven, so they really are answering the right questions. It's also important to note that some of the interactions I've talked about and others, we simply have no methods for carrying out monitoring at this time. And the only way we're really going to move forward on these is with some strategic research investments and really try to settle these questions. And this is part of what the report does, is really call for international collaboration and cooperation to identify these necessary research and strategic research projects, and even to try to think about ways that they ought to be funded. What is government's purview? What is the private developer's purview, etc. As an example, much of the behavioral work with marine mammals and fish around turbines is unlikely to be solved simply by ongoing monitoring, probably at great expense by developers. but augmented. We still need those data from around turbines, but augmented by some very well-developed research projects, we may really get at what this behavioral response is and maybe understand what that risk of collision is, that it may in fact be a very small risk. So that's the report. The final version's up here, that long URL there, but if you are familiar with TSIS, if you simply go to tsis.pnnl.gov, you can pick it right off the top crawl on the web page. There is the full report. It's actually 3 different resolutions. If you wanted to print it, you'd go to the very high resolution. No need if you're not printing it. We have an executive summary, an 8-page executive summary that I think really hits the highlights. And I'm very pleased to say it has been translated into six other languages besides English, and 7 other languages. Can't count. This represents the span of all the Annex IV countries. Every Annex IV country participant speaks one of those languages, and those Annex IV representatives have done these translations, and they're all up there. There is also a set of 1-page summaries, 1 page front and back, that summarizes many of these key interactions I've talked about: collision, underwater noise, EMF, etc. So I really invite you to visit that page, download the report. We're always really, really interested in hearing from you, and including if we've made mistakes, please let us know. We have done a great deal of review of this report, but we're always open to learning more. And I want to thank you. There are the Annex IV nations listed in alphabetical order, the 13 nations we work with. This has been a really, really wonderful collaboration. We get really good participation from all these nations. I might tell you that spans 10 time zones, so getting everybody together even on a call is quite challenging. But we have been fortunate to have really good participation and collaboration, including writing many chapters of the State of the Science report. I do want to, on behalf of Annex IV, acknowledge the extremely generous support we get from the U.S. Department of Energy, Wind and Water Power Program, and also the Ocean Energy Systems. And finally, without the real assistance and focus of researchers, developers, and regulators worldwide, we couldn't have gotten as far as we have. So that's really it. I guess we're ready for questions, right?
At this time, if you'd like to ask a question, you can send a note to all presenters or all moderators, or if you prefer to ask your question through the phone line, you can dial #2 on your phone to put yourself into the queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted, at which point you can state your name and your question. If your question is answered before we get to you, dialing #2 a second time will take you back out of the queue. Additionally, if you are on VoIP with a headset and microphone, you can go up to the emoticons button or raise hand button and use that to raise your hand.
Great, thank you, Andrea. Well, while we wait for some more questions to come in, we have received a few, so I guess we can get underway with those. So the first question is, I understand ocean thermal was likely not part of this assessment due to the lack of real projects. However, was there any conversation about ocean thermal?
Great question. Thank you. Ocean Energy Systems, OES, actually looks at all aspects of ocean energy development that includes ocean thermal energy conversion, or OTEC. It looks at ocean currents, salinity differences, etc. And we've acknowledged that in this report, but because of the lack of focused research and certainly projects in the water, we did concentrate on wave and tidal. I will tell you that we are hopeful that we will have yet another 4 years of working on Annex IV, and we will be working on another State of the Science report due out in 2020. By then, I am hopeful that we will have several other technologies to look at strongly. The other one that has really come up recently, of course, the tidal range. Now, tidal barrages have not been somewhere we've wanted to go, because we know from the few tidal barrages in the world that there's considerable damage done a lot of damage done to estuaries and river mouths. But tidal lagoons is really seems to be coming on as a technology. And the tidal lagoon, if you don't know, is sort of surrounding a tidal area with a causeway, but not across the mouth of a river. And we have acknowledged in this report that these are coming on, and it will be important to look at the environmental effects, but we're not quite there yet. But great question. I think we would like to span more of these technologies.
Okay, so the next question is rather lengthy, but it is a good question. So Section 1.5.2 states that info in the report is not intended to direct permitting or consenting actions, and yet this is the most comprehensive contemporary summary of the current evidence base to use to inform such decisions. Do you have any views on how this time lag between science and decision-making might be reduced? For example, are there plans to produce position papers on key issues as the evidence base increases, such as EMF?
Again, very nice question. The disclaimer language in the report very much says this is the basic state of the knowledge. We think we have captured where we are in 2016, but this will never take the place of having some site-specific knowledge for particular projects. This hopefully will really, really cut down what needs to be collected, but it's important to really understand the water body, the animals, the habitats, and the particular attributes of the device. But the second part of that question really speaks to something that we have talked about a lot in Annex IV recently, that it does take a long time, particularly with research projects, once the science has been generated, if you will, to really get it out there in the public domain. So we do have plans for that. And if you go to this page on TSIS and you look for the one-page summaries, what you will see are these sort of encapsulated what we know. We have recently made the commitment to update those particular summaries, and they are, as I said, things like noise and EMF and collision and so on, and also to produce more of those summaries. At the same time, moving into this next phase of Annex IV, we are certainly looking at the possibility of writing position papers, call them white papers, whatever, to try to really bring forward some of these issues. And in some cases, they may be simply more summarizing what's been done most recently. Other cases, they may actually be thought pieces about where we ought to be going. But there is a real recognition and commitment to trying to accelerate that science out to the public realm. Yes.
Okay, great. So the next question is, can you please describe the required strategic research investments that you discussed in Chapter 10 in more detail? What sort of research subjects in particular should be targeted?
Great question. Well, the report goes into some detail about, there's sort of three buckets, if you will. There are certain interactions we know how to measure and monitor for right now. For example, densities of seals or marine mammals of other sorts swimming in an area. We do have some good tools to look at those. There's always opportunities to improve on them, but they're pretty decent. We have others where we don't have a very good way to measure these interactions, and I think the collision risk is a very key one. There are devices going in the water in the UK over the next year which will have video cameras pointed right at the turbines to see animals interacting, and also sonar right there at the turbine. What we are still not very good at is integrating those instruments and dealing with the data that come out of them. For example, if you were to have a video camera focused on a device 24/7, you get terabytes and terabytes of data in just a few days' time. So we need to have a better way to integrate these and so on, and that is a very much a strategic research project. How do you really bring all those kinds of things together and understand what the outcomes, what the data are showing you? We have other kinds of interactions or potential interactions we have no ability to monitor. For example, avoidance at a large scale. What if you were to have a whole line of tidal turbines or 100 WECs out in the ocean, And this changed the pathway of migratory whales, large whales, for example. We have no way to monitor that at all, but we need to be sort of prepared in the future to be able to do that. So that's another place where really looking strategically at how we would have the tools, the methods, the interpretation, the science to do that. So those are just some examples. But what between some of the programs that Annex IV is working with, there are other international networks that are working towards identifying what these key interactions, these key research projects ought to be. The Offshore Renewables Joint Industry Program in the UK is one. RICOR is just coming out with a report out of the European Union looking at what some of these key issues should be, et cetera. FERN out of Eastern Canada, et cetera. So it's really defining what those research questions are that are keeping us from moving forward with permitting or consenting, and breaking those down to really researchable questions, and then determining who can best do that work and where that sponsorship, those funds need to come from. I don't know if that really answered the question. There were lists of them coming out of many different organizations, and I think you'll be seeing a lot of that in the near future.
Right. No, that was a great response, Andrea. So the next question, I think you've probably touched on this, and I know I was going to mention it later, but it doesn't hurt to reiterate. How does one obtain a copy of the document?
Please look at your screen and go to that download site. And as I say, if that's a hard one to get written down, tethys.pnnl.gov, and there's an upper sort of a crawl across the top that changes right up by the top left-hand corner, and you can click right to the page that will have the three resolutions of the report, the executive summary in English and the other languages, and the one-pagers.
So the next question, I believe, was may have been previously discussed as well, but so it sounds like some progress is being made towards better understanding the effects of EMF and possibly retiring that risk. What are the immediate data gaps or information needs that remain, and how do you propose to address those?
It's a great question. EMF has been looked at somewhat in a laboratory situation, how much EMF at what frequencies disturb what animals in what ways. There's a lot more we could learn there, but it may be a bit of an endless project. We did a lot of that in our lab, and then when you start looking statistically how many experiments you need, it becomes really, really a bit overwhelming. And the reason for this is we're talking about behavioral changes. And getting animals to behave, quote, normally in the lab is difficult. And then understanding as you apply a stressor like EMF, what they're doing, happening to them is difficult too, because animals like us, they acclimate to a disturbance. They may be very bothered by something initially and then they choose to ignore it. There does, however, need to be better investigation for a few key organisms. For example, there's been a lot of focus on American lobster. If we were to have many EMF cables, or cables emitting EMF in an area, is there the potential the animals would not cross those cables? These experiments have been done, or it's observations of them in the field for a few species, but there are still species that we really do need to rule out that this will not harm their ability to get to the habitats they need to reproduce. And the ones that we're going to focus on, obviously, are those that are endangered or threatened species, and then those that are commercially or recreationally important. There have also been a number of efforts, especially on the West Coast, West and East Coast, to measure EMF from cables in the field and understand how animals are reacting to them. Again, these field experiments, it's really difficult to narrow down in a sort of a multi-stressor environment like the ocean that EMF might be the culprit. We do have some recent work out of Europe, the Marvin Project, which is reported on the State of the Science report by Andrew Gill, who wrote that chapter. That is the first really good attempt at measuring EMF from cables. It happened to be an offshore wind farm. So we have some good suggestions, but there are definitely some more work that needs to be done measuring EMF in the field, understanding what you're seeing in terms of reactions from animals, especially long term, and some more laboratory sort of dose response measurements on key organisms. But I think we're getting closer to sort of a weight of evidence that this is probably not going to be a huge issue. Again, once we get many, many cables in the ocean in close proximity, maybe we need to keep checking back.
Great. So next question, what are your recommendations regarding the use of passive acoustic monitoring in high-energy tidal environments? Have studies shown moored and or drifting hydrophones to be effective for characterizing pre- and post-deployment noise levels and or marine mammal detection and localization?
So passive acoustics, that is listening for animals, those that are the marine mammals that do echolocate, which of course are the cetaceans, the dolphins, porpoises, whales. This has been the standard method of listening for these in the ocean. The challenge comes in, especially in high-energy tidal environments, because there is a lot of turbulence and so-called pseudo-noise, noise generated that isn't true noise in these environments, everything from sort of dissipation of turbulence all the way through boulders and rocks rolling around on the bottom that really sort of challenges these standard oceanographic methodologies for listening. There has been great success with drifting hydrophones, that is those that are not moored but drifting past the area you're interested in, the tidal area, and then being picked up and moved back. There's been a lot of really good work done along those lines, both in Europe and here in the west coast of the U.S. And they certainly work better than moored hydrophones, because moored hydrophones are very subject to this sort of pseudo-noise and masking and so on. So I think passive acoustics are an important tool for understanding what animals are doing in this area. I think that probably the most important aspect is understanding how animals are reacting around tidal turbines is not going to be solved with a single instrument package or single instrument type. We probably need passive acoustics to listen to those animals. Many marine mammals and most fish and sea turtles and so on do not emit sounds, do not echolocate. So we do need other tools, and that's where sonar, active acoustics, video, and so on come in. No one of those systems is going to solve this problem. We need to understand how to sort of gang these systems up, trigger one to another, and as I mentioned before, there really is a massive problem with the amount of data that are generated. Finding ways to pre-process those data on board the instrument packages and also develop algorithms so that we can automatically process data for images or targets and so on. So passive acoustic monitoring, absolutely an important tool, but it's one of the tools in the toolbox.
Okay. Are there any mechanisms within the Annex IV program to allow for meta-analysis across different projects which are studying the same key issues? Something like this would hopefully increase confidence in applying the findings in environmental assessment processes.
Great question. I think these kind of meta-analysis is absolutely what Annex IV wants to do, and we are hungry for some of the data that are going to start to come out of these projects. What we have found is that with most devices that have been in the water worldwide, the vast majority have been in for a short time in a testing mode. There may or may not have been much environmental data collected, but as more devices are going in for longer periods of time, and especially the first tidal arrays, and hopefully soon some more wave devices, we really hope there will begin to be enough data these kind of meta-analyses can be done. And we certainly have plans, as I say, we're hungry for that. This is the end of the second 3-year phase of Annex IV, and we're hoping to work towards another one. The thing is, when this whole project started in 2008, 2009, there was a real belief that by about 2012, certainly by 2016, we would have solved all these problems. We're not there yet, and a lot of it is lack of real available data sets. So I guess that's a plea to any developers. researchers to really bring your data together. Annex IV is happy to be a facilitator to help make some of that happen, but let's try to really move towards those meta-analyses, because that may very well be our pathway to retiring certain of these risks.
Great. Relative to baseline and monitoring the environment for projects, what level of detail should be made directly to the public?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Relative to baselining and monitoring the environment for projects, what level of detail should be made directly to the public?
Okay. Well, Annex IV and the whole TESIS database, we have a real commitment to complete transparency. Now, for this State of the Science report, we use data that was published, data papers reports that was published, or relatively available. Some of our authors of these chapters were really helpful because they're on the front line of some of the research, so we had access to information quite early. But we have a very strong commitment that all information should be publicly available. As I think I said before, this industry shouldn't be competing company to company at this point. We all need to be trying to move it forward. And from the regulators and stakeholders and the public's point of view, these tidal wave and other devices can be a really important part of a renewable energy portfolio moving forward in climate change mitigation, et cetera. But we all want to do this responsibly, and holding back any information doesn't make sense. Now, that's not to say that researchers don't have the right to publish their data in a, sort of a timely but organized fashion, and obviously regulators and developers need time collectively to look at information coming out of projects to understand it. But we are really urging in very short order to get as much information available as possible. However, that is one of the places I think Annex IV can help with these kinds of systems, because a great deal of raw data put out to the public, generally speaking, isn't very helpful.
Great. So with the collision issue, it was mentioned that behavior is extremely important to consider. Aren't marine mammals intelligent enough to detect and avoid operating tidal turbines underwater, or is there research that suggests otherwise?
That's a great question. We simply don't know, and there is a good deal of differing opinions among the research community. We don't think animals run into things underwater very often. The question, again, arises because of these very high energy environments. Is it more difficult for an animal to use its sensory capabilities in the same way as it might in a lower energy environment? So would this, for instance, any sound coming out of the turbine be masked and therefore not alert the animal? We simply don't know. I think there's some real questions, too, about how animals are using these environments, and this is one of the first real areas that researchers in the UK and elsewhere are tackling. What do marine mammals do in these environments? Why are they there in these very fast-moving waters where it must be difficult to swim? And the consensus is they're there because there's food, and we need to understand more about how they use these environments. Therefore, are they likely to even be there when the tide is running sufficiently high to generate power, etc.? We're still at kind of an early stage in this. And I think there are groups that, and I think it's very reasonable to say these animals have great sensory capabilities, but is there the possibility that they could be masked somewhat in these situations? These are the questions we need to answer.
How does the document deal with interactions that may not yet be identified, such as other unknowns?
Yeah, the unknown unknowns. Well, we have, since we started work in Annex IV back in 2009, 2010, we have tried very hard to take into account what all these interactions might be. And this particular State of the Science report reports on considerably more than 20 did in 2010, not because we didn't know what they were, but that we just had limited abilities and data to report on. We haven't seen anything really new come on the horizon in the last few years. It's not to say it couldn't, and I think it is really the purview of particularly the research community, but also aided by the developers who may have people out in the water who are seeing something new and different. It's never right to say that we've got all these interactions figured out, but we think we have the major ones. So, but always open to, and that's why we're always interested if people have thoughts, input, know of information from perhaps some other industry, perhaps some other part of the ocean that might be relevant. Drop us a line on TSIS.
Right. Okay, so the last question I have, which is fitting for the last question and because we are almost out of time, is what is next for Annex IV?
Great question. I think it's today, actually, in Sweden. The Ocean Energy System Executive Committee is looking at our proposal for the next 4 years, and we have every indication they will accept it. We certainly hope so. Our body of work, our proposed work plan, is doing more of what we've been doing and doing it well. That is keeping up the TSIS database, webinars, expert forums, various other sorts of engagement and outreach tools. And if you're not familiar with those, please visit TSIS and look around. We also plan this time around to do a lot more direct engagement with regulators in a number of nations. We tend to have regulators involved when we've held workshops, and certainly they're on webinars and so on, but we think there is information from one jurisdiction to another that could be very helpful, and we think we can help bring research information together with regulatory needs and move that sort of, give the regulators some tools to be able to do their tasks, because most of them are pretty overwhelmed with these new systems as well. We also will be taking on for the first time more of the social acceptance, social economic issues. We have stuck pretty closely up to now to the real environment sort of issues, but we will be starting to move into that more. And as I mentioned earlier, we have hopes of putting together some position papers, white papers, summaries of new and sort of emerging information as it becomes available. So that's kind of it. We hope to, we have been involved in sponsoring a number of workshops, co-sponsoring with conferences and so on, and we hope to continue those kinds of engagements.
Great. Well, with that, we're almost out of time. So, Andrea, if I could just ask you to go to the next slide, please.
Oh, yeah. Here we go.
I'd like to thank Andrea for the great presentation on the State of the Science report, and thank you all for participating in today's webinar. As always, a recording of this webinar will be made available on TSIS. You can find it under the webinars page, and the State of the Science report is also available there. If you go to the TSIS site and just type in State of the Science, it should be one of the first entries that comes up. The next Annex IV webinar is planned for June 14th, so about a month from now, and the title of that will be the role of biofouling in marine renewable energy development. And for those of you who are not on the webinar mailing list, and this the webinar information was sent to you from a colleague, if you send an email to a blank email to that email address right there that is shown, you will be automatically put on our webinar list and receive future updates. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all once again. Thank you, Andrea, and have a nice rest of your morning and afternoon.